Kirsten will do like a little.
But then for our question period, she will be joined by our panelists to answer some questions from the audience. So our panelists today are Dr. Shelley Arnott and Dr. Bill Hintz. Dr. Arnott is a professor of aquatic ecology at Queen's University, and her research group uses field experiments and lake surveys to understand how aquatic communities respond to environmental change. And Dr. Hintz is an assistant professor at the University of Toledo, and his research group looks at the impacts of pollution and invasive species on food webs and ecosystem services, including impacts to fisheries. So please join me today in welcoming Dr. Dugan.
Great, thanks for the wonderful introduction. Lots of familiar names out there on the participant list, so it's good to talk to everyone virtually. So I don't think there's probably a better audience I could present this topic to on salinization of our fresh water. It's a perennial problem that pops up definitely in the news each year. I think it's been covered more by the mainstream media in the last 5 years. You can't really open a newspaper in the winter without seeing some headline about the crazy quantity of road salt that we use and what it's doing to our freshwater resources. And this isn't a localized problem. It's a problem in the United States, in the Midwest and Northeast, and across many provinces of Canada, especially kind of Ontario eastward. And so I think a lot of us are familiar just in our own personal lives with the sort of excess road salt that is used every winter. And this is something that has often been ignored, these sort of large piles of salt that coat our roads. And as limnologists, it's something that we are becoming more aware of as an environmental pollutant. I wouldn't say it's a new problem. There's been papers written for decades on chloride contamination, but I think there's been a resurgence in the sort of field of study over the last little while. And for any of us who have ever, stuck a conductivity meter in some of the streams in some of our larger cities in the region, the presence of blue crabs in urban rivers might not be a mystery to us. It's pretty obvious why they're happily living there. And salt is great because it's effective. It depresses the freezing point of water. It's cheap. There's very few things you can buy millions of tons of. And it's natural, which means that people think it's okay for the environment. Downside is that for every ounce of salt that we put down on the ground, it's ending up in our soil and eventually in our water. And this would be fine if it was done on a small scale, but it's not. The United States puts down over 23 million tons of salt as road salt per year. So this is just the quantity of road salt. There's other salt sources. And this happens year after year. And we've been salting roads pretty heavily since the 1960s. So we're now going on 60 years of kind of a tremendous amount of anthropogenic salt that's laid down pretty ubiquitously across a huge swath of our continent. And to give you some perspective on numbers, Wisconsin uses about 500,000 tons of road salt per year. And that comes at an environmental cost, but it also comes at an economic cost. That salt is now $70 a ton. This price has gone up pretty dramatically over the last few decades. And so the state spends about $83 million a year on annual expenditures for road de-icing. To give you some context, about half of that is just purchasing salt, and the other half is paying people to put it down and costs of capital investment and equipment. To give you some sense of what a major Canadian city uses, Toronto on average uses about 130,000 tons per winter. No idea how much your bid contracts are, but these are economic costs, both in terms of the actual purchasing and application, but also has economic costs in terms of long-term viability of infrastructure. So what's interesting here is that there is an incentive, a big economic incentive to use less salt, as well as an environmental incentive. And as I said, these are road salt numbers. Road salt, this is data from the state of Minnesota, which is very similar to Wisconsin in terms of our demographics. And chloride budget for the state that came out last year showed that about half of road salt released into the environment was half of salt released to the environment was road salt, but there was a pretty big proportion from agriculture, and that's a combination of both synthetic fertilizer as potassium chloride and also livestock excretion. We have a lot of cows, and even if cow poop has a very small fraction of chloride in it, when you sum that up over all of the livestock that we have, it adds up. It adds up. Also, household water softeners. Depending on the region, that can be a pretty big salt use, but that tends to be a kind of classified a little bit more as a point source polluter, because usually those are going to a waste treatment plant that are then discharging into a specific river, but it's still usually discharged into surface water. And the result of all this salt use is that we have chloride concentrations in our surface waters that are orders of magnitude higher than they naturally would be. So this is chloride data from the city of Milwaukee. So it's the biggest city in Wisconsin. And you can see that in the winter, these chloride concentrations get above a milligram per liter of salt. Above a gram per liter of salt. And, pre-development, these rivers would have been less than 10 milligrams. And so there's, an obvious seasonal signal here associated with winter salting. Storm sewers in Madison, this is conductivity measurements, but, at times we have conductivity measurements that are well on their way to being ocean water that are feeding into our surface waters in our lakes here in Madison. The result is that over the period of salting, the chloride concentrations in a lot of lakes have been steadily going up. And it's interesting when you start thinking about the trajectory of these trends and when they might level off. But at present, there's been no signs of reaching some sort of steady state, although theoretically there should be a steady state if our rate of salting is constant. And so you can see here, these are lakes in Madison. They've been increasing over the last 80 years, getting upwards of 50 to 100 milligrams per liter. This is the long-term data set from Lake Simcoe, so a large lake in Ontario, showing that same steady trend. These lakes are integrators of their watershed, and they have sometimes long residence times, and these trends don't show any signs of leveling off or decreasing, and these are now become areas of concern. And if we take all of the chloride data that we can find, this is from Wisconsin and Minnesota, you can see that there's definitely spatial trends in chloride. In this case, if you're familiar with the geography of these two states, the bottom half is pretty developed. There's more cities and more agriculture. The top of these states is more wilderness. And you can see that there are lots of lakes and rivers that have chloride concentrations that are getting to be, 100 milligrams per liter or higher. And the problem with this is that we need fresh water. I don't have to explain that to people who are listening to this talk. Fresh water is important, and it's that word fresh in there is critical to both drinking water and also to aquatic habitats. Organisms that live in rivers and lakes are adapted to fresh water, and as we increase salinity of those habitats, we risk destroying our freshwater habitats. And there are a lot of published thresholds for what sort of concentrations we should be concerned about. And so I've compiled a few here, and I think this is an interesting, I think this is where limnologists could spend hours talking about these numbers, thinking about what is there a threshold at which we should be concerned about chloride, and are these numbers meaningful, and what can we learn from them? The EPA's, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, numbers come from a series of laboratory tests where they do tank experiments and look at fatality in organisms and kind of average that number. And so there are organisms that are definitely affected at concentrations below these numbers, and there's also organisms that seem totally fine at these concentrations or higher. The lowest threshold I could find in poking around literature is the state of Michigan, which has a in their water quality guidelines, their state government has a mandate that chloride shouldn't exceed 50 milligrams per liter in the Great Lakes watershed. And so you can see that these numbers kind of range from 50 milligrams upwards of hundreds of milligrams. And it's unclear at this point. There's been some really good research coming out lately on how chloride concentrations shift food webs. And I think that's something that's worth maybe talking about with the panelists. They both do some really interesting organismal research. These are two 2020 papers, one from Shelley and co-authors looking at chloride concentrations in zooplankton, and one that just came out from California. And you can see, if you just look at these x-axes, that these are looking at very different ranges of chloride concentrations. One's from, basically no chloride to 140 milligrams per liter, and one's from 0 to 3,000. And so there's lots of evidence of sort of different thresholds at which chloride concentrations might be impacting community composition and structure. So this is, I think, the area, one area of, I guess you could say, salinization research on lakes that there's still a lot to be learned. But one question, thinking about habitat is, how has habitat changed? How have lakes concentrations sort of shifted from their natural state? And so what I wanted to briefly talk about today is a study that myself and co-authors conducted over the last couple of years, asking the question of how widespread chloride pollution is. And this study was conducted in the Midwest and Northeast United States. A few reasons for that. One is data is pretty readily available, both spatial data, hydrology data, and chloride data. And so it was easier to compile for this region, kind of stopping at that border. And these states are particularly freshwater rich. They contain over 40,000 lakes larger than 4 hectares. There are also states that are particularly reliant on road salt application. So it's a unfortunate combination of having a lot of lakes and having a lot of road salts. As you go south or west of here in the United States, you get either less road salt or less lakes, or both. And the prevalence and spatial distribution of chloride pollution in these lakes is relatively unknown. And as I said, this is also an economic problem. This region spends about $1.4 billion a year on road de-icing. And so if we can lower our use of road salt, this has benefits in the environment and our pocketbooks. And so I'm going to go over this paper that we published this year on looking at chloride contamination across this region. And how this study was conducted was using available water quality data from the United States Water Quality Portal, and using a machine learning model to predict drivers of chloride concentration, and then using that model to predict regional chloride concentrations. So this started with getting all the data we could from the Water Quality Portal, which ended up being from 2,700 lakes, about 30,000 observations, which were not evenly spatially distributed. And so you can see that there's some states that have better water quality monitoring programs than others. Another thing that was unique about this data set was that most of the observations were from the summer. So that's something to keep in mind, something I'm going to touch back on at the end about the seasonality of those observations. Also, this data set was biased towards larger lakes. We tend to monitor larger lakes because they're used more. Small lakes are often, smaller lakes are more abundant, and they're also sometimes harder to get to. Let's see. So we then combined the chloride concentration observations with a data set of watershed and land use characteristics. So thinking about land use and road density, and then applied a machine learning model to look at the importance of some of those variables. So we used a quantile regression forest model, which is similar to random forests, which you might be familiar with, to model the relationship between observed chloride and lake and watershed characteristics. And this type of model is really nice because it can accommodate a large number of correlated predictor variables. So if we think about land use, a lot of those variables are correlated. You know, if you have more forest, you have less agriculture. Also the presence of nonlinear responses. So that's another benefit of using models like random forests. You can have nonlinear responses. And you can look at the potential importance of interactions among those predictor variables. And so this was done using the Ranger package in R. And to avoid overfitting, we had a pretty kind of comprehensive customized sampling routine where we sampled 95% of the data and predicted on the holdout 5%. So we don't think that our model results are not fitted to the data. And there's also uncertainty surrounding those estimates. So there's a lot of methodological detail in the paper if you're interested in how this works. So the importance was calculated via permutation, and this graph gives you a sense of the relative importance. So on the top is the developed land in the watershed, the percent of crops in the watershed, the distance from the nearest interstate were the top 4 predictors. At the bottom, things that were less important were things like lake area and the month of sampling, which we didn't expect. Month of sampling might be important if we had more observations from the winter. So this might be a biased outcome of the fact that most of our samples were taken from, May through September. And we also expected lake area or watershed area to have an impact, but it might be that there are some residence time. Residence time might be a factor that's would kind of give us a better sense of how long the water was staying there. And that was something that we didn't have in this model because we didn't have lake depth or inflows for a lot of these systems. So we did find that land use and interstate distance were the major drivers of chloride concentration for our data set. And you can see some of these nonlinear responses in looking at feature contributions. And I won't get into this too much, but these are all on a log scale. But as you increase, panel C is as you increase developed land in the watershed, you're going to have higher chloride concentrations. Panel D is crops. And so this shows actually that as you increase crops, there's a sort of a nonlinear response till you hit a certain threshold of crop percentage before it sort of has an impact. And so these feature contributions are nice ways to look at nonlinearity of drivers. The model predictions were pretty good. I think these are, again, log scales, so they mask a little bit of that spread, but the correlations were pretty tight. We were able to predict chloride concentrations surprisingly well based on our land use characteristics. So these were these are two scatter plots, so just the model outputs versus our observations for predicted models and for per observation and per lake. And there's a few things to keep in mind. One is trying to predict chloride concentrations using a median might be masking seasonal variability. And this is something that we're aware of, is that chloride can vary a lot on an annual basis in a lake. So this is data from Diamond Lake in the city of Minneapolis. It's a pretty good example of seasonal variability, where concentrations in the winter are upwards of 300 milligrams per liter. And then in the summer, they drop down to near zero. Unfortunately, this lake lies at the intersection of two major interstates and is pretty small, so it gets these major winter spikes. But the median concentration in this lake is 115 milligrams per liter, so it's still pretty representative of chloride pollution. And so even though the median masks this range, it still gives a good indication of poor water quality overall in terms of chloride. The other problem that we had was just thinking about data quality, and it's for any model, the underlying data is important for how robust your model output is. And we use data from the water quality portal, which is an amazing endeavor by the USGS and EPA in the United States. It's a really simplified avenue for data access and enables large modeling efforts that wouldn't be possible at this multi-state level if you were trying to do it on your own. But the secondary use of data comes with the challenge of quality control. And this is an example of lake from Minnesota again, in Minneapolis. And you can see in this time series, there's one data point that is basically 0 milligrams per liter. And just visually inspecting this, we could say it's probably an outlier. And there's ways of dealing with outliers in data sets. And so outliers are not as much of a challenge as other data quality problems. There was an analysis by Laurie Sprague and colleagues at USGS that came out in 2017 that looked at the water quality portal, and they painstakingly examined about 25 million water quality records and found that over 14 million had some kind of missing or ambiguous metadata. And that ambiguity can manifest in a number of ways, including just the parameter name, how it was filtered, the chemical form, and especially units. So I don't know about you, but if you ever downloaded a data set, you'll get things like temperature recorded in, moles. And there are things that are obvious unit mistakes. And then there are things that are less obvious, like something, recorded as micromoles when it should be moles, for instance. And in our experience using these data sets, chloride is actually probably less likely to have ambiguity because there are less chemical forms that are typically measured, especially when you can compare it to something like nitrogen. And the units tend to be more standardized as well. But that doesn't mean there still isn't problems with trying to use water quality data that you didn't measure yourself. And so a more difficult challenge than identifying outliers is determining whether some of those observations are wrong. And so one approach that we took was to actually use the model and use the model residuals to examine some of that data that might be suspect. So there's a handful of lakes where the observations were more than 500 milligrams per liter, and our predictions were much lower. And so that sort of raised some flags. One example I'll share with you is Burden Lake in New York. Had a bunch of water quality records that range from 400 to 1400 milligrams per liter, which is very high. And yet our model predicted it to be about 20. And so, that raised some flags as to what we were missing. Was there like some giant salt mine beside this lake that was going to have a point source pollutant? There was nothing we could find. And in fact, when we started digging through other published reports, it seemed like our model predictions were actually correct and the observations in the water quality portal were wrong. but that skews the entire, model results. And so this is something that, just as we start doing these larger studies, need to be aware of is the potential for erroneous data in these secondary data sets. But hopefully, as you get enough data, that becomes more noise. We also then took our model and tested it against some holdout data sets. So we tested it against some water quality data from Minnesota, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin, and also from the National Lakes Assessment from the EPA. And again, had pretty strong correlations between these holdout data sets. So this gave us confidence in our predictors. And so then we took this model and applied it to every lake in the United States, the US Midwest and Northeast United States. And what we found was that most lakes are pretty low in chloride. The median was, around, or the mode, I guess, was around 10 milligrams per liter. And we considered 6.3 milligrams per liter to be our cutoff for sort of what we consider undeveloped lakes based on land use. And, almost half of the lakes in this region kind of fell below that 6.3 cutoff for undeveloped lakes. And so this is good news. I think the outcome of this is that most lakes still have relatively low chloride concentrations, but there's a few on that high end that are of concern. So this overall, this is, I think, a positive finding is that most of the lakes, most of these 49,000 lakes are doing pretty well. But that's not to say they can't be affected in the future. And if you're familiar with your United States geography, most of the lakes that we predicted to have concentrations more than 50 milligrams per liter were sort of spatially located near major urban centers. Or along near interstates, which is some of those are mapped out actually pretty well on this map here. And so the results were that we found that only 4% of these 49,000 lakes will be more than 50 milligrams per liter, and 82% were less than 20. But this should be taken with a word of caution that even pristine lakes should probably be monitored for chloride, knowing that urbanization continues to develop in a lot of these places. So what's next? Well, a few things. One is that there's been, I think, there's need for more observations of chloride concentrations in the winter in these ecosystems. This is a paper that we published a couple years ago from just a small pond here on campus, which shows that chloride concentrations spike under the ice from ion rejection from the ice cover. And the shallower your lake and the thicker the ice cover, the more ion rejection you're going to have, and the higher that under ice chloride concentration. And so this is something that limnologists are aware of in terms of ion chemistry under ice, but again, it hasn't been all that studied in lakes that have high chloride concentration to begin with. So ion rejection normally isn't a problem because concentrations of chloride are so low. If you double them from 0.5 milligrams per liter to 1 milligrams per liter, it's not having an impact. But if you're going from, in this case, 200 to 300 milligrams per liter up to 1,000, that's going to have potentially, a lot more serious impacts on your organisms in that pond or lake. Another project that we've been working on is thinking about trajectories of chloride concentrations. And so this is a paper that we just submitted looking at the slow salinization of Sparkling Lake here in Wisconsin, which interestingly was the subject of a paper in 1992 by Carl Bowser here, who looked at groundwater pathways for chloride pollution in lakes. And his model is actually shown in this sort of gray dashed line, which is a simple box model predicting the chloride concentration in the lake to reach steady state with the groundwater inflow. And we don't see those type of trajectories in our lakes. Instead, we see this kind of sigmoid curve here in black, where we have kind of an exponential, we have a sort of a slow takeoff on chloride concentrations, followed by kind of an exponential rise and then tapering off. And so we've been modeling trajectories based on catchment soil retention, and that's something that people have published some really interesting papers on the last few years too, thinking about how long chloride resides in the landscape before it actually gets to rivers and lakes. And so Claire Oswald had a great paper, the Lake Simcoe watershed, thinking about how much of that chloride's retained on the landscape. And it, there's places where it's above 50%. And then thinking about, does that become saturated at some point? Is your soil storage capacity saturated, at which point your lake's concentrations then start increasing rapidly? And so that's sort of some next steps that we're taking here in Wisconsin. So I'm going to wrap up to get to the panel because I think there should be some fun questions. But I will say that what's nice about chloride contamination is that I think it's a problem that we can solve. Chloride is a pretty conservative ion and doesn't, if we stop putting chloride on the landscape, these lakes should eventually flush out, even if there's a lot of chloride stored in soil still. And that really comes down to kind of optimizing salt use. And there's been a lot of outreach work across the United States and Canada focused on salt awareness and the need to lower our salt use. And so we're seeing a lot of work here switching to liquid brine application, which can basically cut salt use in half just by using brine. And then thinking about policy options and regulations as, considering salt as a pollutant. So I think we're at this tipping point now in terms of sort of limnology bordering up with policy and also economics to really think about salt pollution and work towards sort of solving this problem in the future. So I'm going to stop there and looking forward to some of the panel discussion.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, Hilary.
Thanks, Kirsten.
I'm not sure if the schedule is planned this way, but it seems sort of intentional that we are having this talk as we move into the winter months. But
probably intentional.
It seems that way. So at this point, I'm going to invite the panelists to turn on their videos. And anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, you're welcome to type it into the chat box. Or if you want, you can use the raise hand function. And you already have a couple of questions here.
Yeah, I see that. I'm reading over this first one. Okay. I think I'm going to answer these in reverse order. Wastewater treatment plants do not remove chloride. So the use of water softener salts are not removed. The difference with kind of water softener salt is that all of the sewage will go to a wastewater treatment plant. And that wherever that wastewater treatment plant discharges is kind of a point source pollutant for chloride. And so in a lot of regions where water softeners are common, those wastewater treatment plants are discharging effluent that is way higher than water quality regulations, and they often have variances to exceed them because they have no option. And so that's something that we deal with here in Madison. Everyone has a water softener, and it's can be really amplified if you have large industries that are using water